Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Okay, welcome back to another edition of NucleCast. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a very special guest, my dear friend. He is the Dr. Dre of Deterrence Education. He is a visiting professor at the Missouri State Program, as many of you know, the program that Keith Payne and the folks at NIP run. He is, of course, and I'm not going to give you his name just yet because I'm not done introducing him. He also flew the E-4B. He's a retired Air Force colonel. He was the associate dean of the Strategic Forces College at the Air Force Institute of Technology. And before that, he was the associate dean at the National War College, where he taught deterrence, which is how we met many moons ago. And it is my pleasure, of course, to bring into the show my dear friend, Curtis McGiffin. So, Curtis, welcome into the show. Welcome to NucleCast.
Adam, it is a pleasure to be here with you and the great folks at ANWA. Just a great opportunity. I can't thank you enough for inviting me to be a part of the program. And I can't say enough how perfect you are as a host for this thing. So this is going to be great. The only bad part is you know so much about me. I have to make sure that we keep the drinking stories away from the education stories.
True. Many things that would not be appropriate for this podcast. So we'll stick to the good stuff.
Well, there we go.
Before we sort of start talking about nuclear education, which is what we decided to talk about today, I wanted to ask you just sort of a way back question. As you look back at the many aircraft that you've flown, which one would you say you enjoyed flying the most?
Oh my gosh, that is a difficult question for a former aviator to pick a favorite, because they all have their great things. I loved flying the EC-135, which is the picture behind me here, the old original Looking Glass, because it was so archaic. As a navigator, I mean, we did the classic stuff. We shot celestial navigation. We flew grid navigation. We did air refueling both ways. It was really when navigators were still doing the art of navigation. I really enjoyed being an instructor on the T-43 when I was an instructor in the Navigator Schoolhouse, which was a modernized 737 flying classroom. I loved it because I loved working with students, and it was just so great to watch them develop into young navigators, not only Air Force, but Navy and international students. But the E-4, the NAOC, the National Airborne Operations Center, was also very special. A big 747 with a crew of 65, and flying and doing our mission was just a tremendous experience. And I was fortunate or unfortunate, depending upon your perspective, to be one of the navigators on the E-4 on 9/11. So flying that mission on that day and watching that and being a part of that experience was a professional benchmark for me, if you will, as far as being an aviator. But great missions. I flew aircraft for 13 years of my career, and it was a boy's dream, and I got to do it, and do it most of it, if not all of it, in the nuclear enterprise.
You know, it's funny. I don't think you've ever told me that you were, in the air on NAOC on 9/11. What was that? I know this wasn't what we were going to talk about, but what was that like? And what can you tell me about that? When you learned what happened on 9/11,
Right.
what was that like?
Well, I'll give a quick and the dirty on this. So we were sitting at Andrews Air Force Base on a modified alert status because we were going to perform some exercise that night. And it was a rare occasion where all 4 E4s were on flying status and prepared to do this mission. It was just dumb luck that day. And we were the group sitting at Andrews, of course, when the airplanes were crashing. So we got the klaxon horn and ran to the truck. And I happened to be the one to get in the driver's seat. There were all kinds of trucks. There were people jumping in the back of the truck and all the trucks, and we're fast driving to the airplane, and you're running to the airplane and getting on board. And the 06 was a Navy 06 that day. Was the team chief was at the bottom of the stairs telling us, this is not an exercise. This is the real thing. We are going. And so we were running up there to perform the actions. We took off just minutes after the impact into the Pentagon. I have memories of looking at that as we turned over the Pentagon, and then flying for the day, basically listening to the aircraft being grounded, all the airliners going from place to place in performing our mission until we could get back. And then we landed at Offutt midday at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. And right after we parked, in comes President Bush, and he parks next to us, and everything's locked down. And he goes in to do his briefings at Stratcom, and it was my moment to get off the airplane and go get a new flight plan. We were picking up extra crew members, our new orders, if you will, some food. Nobody had eaten anything all day. In fact, ironically, the pilot, when he flew the airplane, he took off and flew the airplane barefooted. He never got his boots on until after we had leveled off at altitude and he could actually get up. His toes were almost frozen. So it's a fascinating little sidebars. And that wasn't until then that I actually saw on the TV in the ready room of the towers collapsing. We didn't even know that on the airplane until late afternoon. And then we were given the orders to go back to Andrews to be the lead jet before President Bush was going to return to Washington, D.C. So that was it. And we sat at Andrews for a few weeks and dealt with some other things as that evolved, and sort of we watched our lives change. So that's my event there. That was my big war, if you will. It was one of the few days out there that the NAOC performed an EWO mission, an emergency war order type mission.
Awesome. I don't think you've ever told me that story. So that's an interesting one for sure.
Well, thank you.
So what we wanted to talk about was deterrence education. I mean, you've spent quite a bit of time over the last 10 years that I've known you doing deterrence education. And so I'm sort of curious, as you sitting at Missouri State now and having sat at NDU and National War College, where do you see, and been the dean at Offutt, so 3 sort of different places, where do you see deterrence education right now, both inside the government and in academia?
It's a great question, Adam, and I think it's no matter who you ask, you're going to probably get different opinions. But as you may remember, you and I met while I was on active duty teaching at National War College. In fact, it was a great honor. I was using your textbook in the class, and I had got a chance to meet you, and I was just so excited. I was like, wow, Dr. Adam Wilder. Hey. And I let you know that we were using your book, and you smiled and thanked me for that. And it was nice. And ever since then, we had struck a nice relationship. And by the way, that's how I met Keith Payne and developed a relationship with Dr. Payne. And really, and that relationship has, of course, continued to today. I would say that back then, talking in the 2014, 2015 timeframe, we were really struggling to try to get deterrence education into the syllabi of any program out there. It was treated as an elective, as an, oh, by the way, we were still figuring out the war on terror, and the Cold War was over, and we had this massive brain drain. And then after the ill-fated events of 2008, that really forced a reorganization within the Air Force, created the Air Force A-10, the firing of a SecAF and a Chief of Staff of the Air Force, which are very cathartic moments for the Air Force, really placed the nuclear enterprise as a number one priority. And I still believe it's there today. But education is I think, slow to come about. And it's not for lack of good intentions. We've had a lot of effort through various programs. I know at one point you were encouraged to create the SANS program, and now that program has evolved into the Air University system. But it's still a small group of professional airmen learning this kind of material, very in depth, but a small group. I'm talking like in the less than 20 per year, and then some electives. And look, some is better than none, but I think every airman, everybody in the Department of Defense should understand deterrence. Everybody in the federal government should understand deterrence because of how it works holistically. But in the end, I think if you use a crawl, walk, run metric, we are now entering into what I call the stagger stage, where the cruising, where your infant is getting up from crawling and is trying to learn how to stand and move from coffee table to couch. That's where we are, I think, as we attempt to get to the walk status. There were other ways to do that, but we've used various programs, including professional continuing education, and I think that has done a lot for the Air Force through the Air Force Institute of Technology, for example, in its nuclear courses and its NC3 courses, which we were both a part of at some point. I think that is done to really educate the nuclear workforce, moving that from the dozens per year to the hundreds per year. Sure. The challenge, Adam, is there are 33,000 nuclear airmen just in and around the global strike world. We're never going to get there at this pace. We've got to do more. We got to continue to do more. And then the last thing I'll say is that one of the biggest challenges to nuclear education, like any education, is education dollars are low-hanging fruit. And often when there is budget pressures, they tend to get cut first. We're going to spend $1.2 trillion modernizing the nuclear enterprise. We can't forget to modernize the workforce right along with it. We've got to bring them back. If you don't think we're in a Cold War 2.0 right now, we'll have to have a whole nother podcast to discuss it.
Yeah, it's a good point, because when you think about it, it's not just, the active duty airmen. I mean, you also have all the civil servants, the contractors. You've got, the folks up at Stratcom. You've got this route, you've got members of Congress that know very little about it. There's, their staffers, the think tanks, even, a place like Heritage or Brookings or CSIS, even within those relatively large think tanks, there's, just one or two folks in each that sort of cover nuclear issues. And, as both you and I know, for the generation of folks that are sort of the deans of deterrence, they're getting a bit long in the tooth these days.
Yep.
And what I've noticed is many of the folks that are, say, perhaps my age, and even a generation below me, it's much more prevalent for folks to, at least there's a much larger community that is focused on disarmament and the rationale for why many believe nuclear weapons, are not good, as opposed to those who focus on, okay, well, how do we actually deter? How do we use nuclear weapons for the purpose of deterrence? And then, God forbid, if, I've persistently said that I think one or a small number of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons might be used by the Russians or the Chinese. How would we deal with that? So it seems that we're there's a real deficit, not just in basic knowledge, but in the folks who understand it really well, and then are teaching and thinking and developing strategies. And we can generally count, you and I this community is relatively small, and we sort of all know each other. And I wonder, how do we do a better job of building, younger folks who are going to, Keith Payne and the folks that, he was a student of Herman Kahn, and then, who that generation below Keith, and then the generation below us. And, that's
right.
How do you see that?
Well, it is it's a challenge, right? So when we have all of these think tanks, many of them think alike, it tends to be, and I don't mean this in any pejorative, but it is an echo chamber. We're all talking to one another. And what we have to figure out is how to talk to the American people. In the 1950s and 60s, the American people were very much a part of the nuclear deterrent calligraphy, the kaleidoscope, right? They understood it, duck and cover and movies and all of these sorts of things to make them understand what was at risk and why we needed to have this great capability. Today, that argument is in the opposite. It's really about, how evil these weapons are or immoral they might be and how dangerous they are. And I like to break it down to just the very fundamentals. And I always ask my students, can you tell me how many people have died since World War II from a nuclear weapon? And the answer is, save a few scientists in Siberia, not many, if none. Certainly none in anger. But then you ask the same question, well, how many people have died from conventional warfare, bullets, bombs, gas, you name it, all those things. And we were watching a bunch of it in Ukraine right now. I would argue it's 4.5 million in the country of Vietnam alone. So I'm not sure where people are coming from when they want to sort of ban the bomb. I'm very much an anti-war person,
sure,
not an anti-nuke person. And what happens, I believe, is that nuclear weapons are a guarantor of peace. And if you're a peacenik, if you're one who doesn't want to see endless wars or be a part of large bloody campaigns of conventional warfare like we're seeing, the value of nuclear weapons and what John Gaddis refers to as the long peace that it guaranteed, I think is very difficult to ignore or discount. And if we will do away with nuclear weapons, what happens after that? And to get back to your original question, we have to develop the learned thinkers, the next generation of learned thinkers, who will be able to make those decisions rationally, not irrationally, based on a political bias or based on the feeling that I shouldn't support these nasty weapons because I want to be invited to the right cocktail parties. The reality is if we go to war, there are no cocktail parties to be invited to. And so I mean, that's just what it is. I want to find the best things to guarantee peace. Okay. And I'm not convinced that massive conventional militaries led by governments that are willing to use them is actually a guarantor of peace. I'm just not guaranteeing. I don't think history shows that. But history does show that large nuclear arsenals tend to prevent large-scale warfare. And I think we have that history to look at.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Yeah, it's funny you should say that because in many respects I see it the same way in the sense that making the world safe for great power wars and world wars that's not my ambition. But
It's a great way to say that.
I've never heard a good, as I say, okay, let's suppose we ban the bomb.
Right.
What then? Are you saying that there's going to be no more world wars? Do you have a way to make that not happen?
Right.
Because and this is a point, we spoke with Brad Roberts the other day, and he very eloquent and clear, concise discussion at this point. You have to be able to think through what happens after, and history is replete with this. When one country expands their conventional capabilities, another country sees it as a threat, and therefore you have this growth of militaries. And then because of our perceptions of how conventional wars can be fought and won, we have a tendency to be willing to fight them. Whereas, and I think it's a psychological issue that relates back to prospect theory, this
yes.
That Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize when they developed this idea that we as humans are irrational when it comes to our risk aversion. And I think nuclear weapons, what they really do well is they force us into becoming really, really risk averse. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I'm not interested in, to borrow a phrase, I'm not interested in making conventional warfare great again. And I think if you ban the bomb, that's what you're going to do. And if it's the argument about cost, I think it's an incorrect argument. The amount of conventional capability that you would need to replace, a single 100 kiloton warhead is tremendously expensive, and it's also very provocative because you've got to have a huge conventional military to deal with it, and so I think I think a lot of this issue about banning the bomb and these sorts of things is really sort of misguided in the sense that what you really want to do is figure out how to obtain some peace,
sure.
and address those issues. And one of the things, Keith Payne gets into this in his writings, that one of the reasons why people hate deterrence, I say hate, disagree with deterrence, want to talk down deterrence, whether they're in a think tank or in the government or wherever they are in this argument, is because deterrence, the idea of nuclear deterrence, puts nuclear weapons in a positive light. And that goes against the whole idea of, if your goal is to ban the bomb, if you're making money arguing for that, if you're getting to the right cocktail parties because you support it, that is why you're going to be anti-deterrence, and you're going to want to say that it doesn't work, and so forth and so on. And nothing is perfect. My goal, circle back to that big question about deterrence education, is to help get the next generation of leaders to think about this in a pragmatic fashion, so that deterrence can actually be conducted successfully, and we can avoid the very wars that we seem to fall into decade after decade after decade. And if we're not in them, we're supporting them, like in this case with the Ukrainian conflict. So they are issues that we have to think through. And it plays into America's grand strategy, which I also teach courses in, by the way, and it plays into the whole thought process of how we shape our economy, whose friends are we going to be, what alliances are we going to have, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why it's whole of government, and that's why we need to have everyone working in this world, in this, if you will, this arena, to be thinking about deterrence theory and how to apply it correctly.
Yeah, I've often wondered, so if you think how government works, even, a democracy in particular, democracies work that politicians tell constituents, hey, I'm going to do things for you in exchange for your vote. And in many respects, the Beltway operates, it's where, what is it, $6.5 trillion of a $22 trillion budget, they get sucked into Washington and then they get, divvied up and respent on programs, and many people walk away very wealthy. And I often think that the perception of nuclear modernization is all wrong. Sort of it, and you mentioned this earlier, if you're a peacenik, if you don't want a lot of defense spending, then you should naturally like nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons, by any effective measure, are a way to drive down defense spending. They don't drive it up because you're not constantly replacing. Even if you had a cyclical 10 or 15 year nuclear modernization program, you're still, for one, it constrains what kind of, sort of exploits the military can engage in, such that with a nuclear arsenal, you're not, finding yourself in far-flung places for somewhat questionable national interests. You're focused at home. You essentially reduce defense spending because nuclear weapons, have a relatively limited purpose in assuring the national sovereignty. Right. So I sort of ask you that question is how do we communicate this more effectively?
Right.
Particularly to young people.
Yeah. So this is where we have to have engaging education opportunities. And to your point, whether you are a believer in retrenchment and isolationism for America, or you're across that gambit, that spectrum to a primacy type of we are the, it's you're with us or against us, to coin to quote President Bush's terminology. In that, whether you are going to be just by yourself or you're going to be the most powerful country in the world, you have to have a strong nuclear deterrent for anything else to work. So there's no way that you can strategically plan or align your national strategy and policy to eliminate nuclear weapons and say that, well, if I retrench, I don't have to have all these weapons. Well, you could lessen your conventional, but you really got to have the nuclear to reach out. If you say, well, I'm going to be the biggest guy in town, so nobody's messes with us, and we're gonna rule the world. Well, you're still going to need to have a pretty powerful, because there's always going to be somebody who wants to knock you down. And that's sort of what we see today in this strategic competition that we're experiencing with Russia and China. But nonetheless, we have to be able to talk about these things and do so in dispassionate's not maybe the right word, but in just a pragmatic way to really understand why it is that we have to have these capabilities, why we may not have enough or the right capabilities, and what do we need to do to obtain it. Again, that's probably a whole nother podcast, but I would say that this plays a role. And the way we've got to do this is we have to raise the next generation of leaders through education, have them understand this. There is nobody in uniform today, save maybe the last 2, 3, or 4-star general in the Air Force, who has ever been on active duty when the Cold War still existed. And I would argue that many of the younger generation of officers, military officers, but maybe all airmen and civilians, are also not thinking about it, because society today is acculturated just in a different way, and in between those is this generation of military person that's mid to senior in rank, who's focused their entire careers on fighting the global war on terror, and are still trying to adjust either intellectually or in posture into this new shift into this great power competition, which really wasn't acknowledged formally until the 2017 national security strategy under the Trump administration. So this is still relatively new for us as a nation, right? To switch from a post 9/11 global war on terror which we did for 17-ish years, and then moved to this new era of, wow, we're back to sort of doing this Cold War thing again, even though nobody really wants to call it that. And how do we deal with it? And we don't have that next generation that's ready to deal with it as well as we would have should, say, the Cold War had never ended. Generations would just continue to evolve and deal with the problem as it is, rather than actually a new problem, right? An evolving old problem is handled much differently than a brand new different problem, right? So education is the only way to do it. And at Missouri State, we have a doctorate program that helps build these learned thinkers in deterrence and grand strategy and national security, if you will, in how to do that at a doctorate level. And sadly enough, Adam, I'll say this last thing. Much of what is going to happen is individuals are going to have to self-teach. They're going to have to pick up your books or Keith Payne's books or other books and articles out there and begin to self-educate and watch podcasts like this and so forth, and take the time to take an interest in that development within themselves, because I'm not so sure that we as an institution, right, the DoD or the academic world or whatever, has enough oomph to get that kind of acculturation into our citizenry the way we could in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and I think Keith Payne did a study a few years ago where he was looking at the number of, say, articles that were written about nuclear deterrence, and he sort of coded them. And he essentially was looking, are they positive or are they negative towards deterrence in the arsenal? And after he collected, it was hundreds and hundreds of articles. And there was a 6-to-1 negative to positive ratio. 6 articles that were negative towards, deterrence and the arsenal and modernization for every one that was positive towards it. And so for those that are in the world of educating airmen and educating civilians who are going to work, in the operationalization of deterrence, the schooling is pretty limited. Your ability to read stuff that actually explains it and explains why you do it and what the purpose is and how it contributes to national security. It's a pretty slim set of options relative to the vast breadth of work that's both academic and policy and think tank that sort of hammer home this point that nuclear weapons are bad and deterrence.
Well, I agree with you, Adam, and I think that's a great observation. I also say that if someone who believes in the nuclear arsenal and nuclear deterrence as a way to guarantee peace, like to the extent that I believe it, and so I would argue that from turning the pessimistic into the optimistic, I would argue that the events of today, right, with the Ukrainian war and all the nuclear threats that come out of Russia, with the as the STRATCOM commander says, the breathtaking modernization program going on in China and the growing of their nuclear arsenal at breathtaking pace, to paraphrase him, Admiral Richard, has sort of renewed America's interest in deterrence education, in nuclear deterrence. What does all of this mean? And I would say that has created a renaissance, if you will, I guess you could say that Putin, is deterrence's greatest salesman in that regard. And so, because I remember even running around the Pentagon in uniform in 2012, 2013, going from meeting to meeting, and arguing some of these issues during initial modernization era under the Obama administration, still getting hearing in the crowded conference room, that's Cold War thinking. This dismissal was still going on even as late as 2013. It was really the invasion of Crimea in 2014, I think, that was the turning point in everything. But prior to that, there was still this sort of holistic eschewing of this kind of idea that this is really going to happen, that we're going to go back to this kind of world. And I think we're back to this kind of world. And if you're watching what's going on with the Iranian agreements and these sorts of things, it's just going to get worse. So we have to figure out how we're going to commit to deterrence. Because if we don't figure out as a country how we want to commit to the theory of deterrence, then we have to figure out how we're going to fight those wars. Because that's what it is, right? The failure of deterrence is war. And so what I want to concentrate on is left of that boom. How do I get our nation's future diplomats, warriors, economists, psychologists, etc., to think about this problem going into the future in a tri-state dynamic, and with all of the influences of today's technology, social media, etc., cyber, and it's just so much more complex. And so we have to start somewhere. And so I think what we're doing is we're in the right direction. We just got to get the numbers up. I would say that just as another shameless plug for the Missouri State program, that the doctorate program that Keith Payne developed is 90 strong in 2 years. So, I mean, that's nothing to shake at. And it's yes, it's a great program, but it's 90 strong because there are people out there that want to study this, that want to understand it, that want to get involved and devote their professional lives to this kind of subject matter. And so meeting that obligation, there's lots of opportunity. There's great programs all around the country that do this. We're just one of them. But I would say that that is an indication to me, Adam, that I think we're going in the right direction as we move to that walk stage in the crawl, walk, run metric.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this episode.
Wow.
It's been a quick, we talked for over half an hour and it's gone quickly. So let me just say thanks for joining us. Curtis McGiffin, visiting professor at Missouri State University's. It's the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. Yes. All right.
And I would say, Adam, thank you very much for having me. I do hope you'll invite me again. And thanks to the good folks at ANWA for hosting this and conducting this program. I just really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thanks. And we'll see you next time on NucleCast.